Okay, so you know when Elon Musk's name pops up, uh, it, everyone pretty much thinks electric vehicles, right? Like Tesla, rockets blasting off, SpaceX, and more recently, that whole thing with social media. But you ever noticed all those smaller details, those curious little things that pop up that kind of paint a different picture of him? That's what we're diving into today.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we've got all these different sources, articles about different parts of his life, his Wikipedia page, which actually has a lot of interesting stuff buried in there, and even transcripts from some pretty in-depth YouTube interviews with his biographer. So today we're going to try to dig up some of those intriguing and maybe a little unexpected parts of his journey, give you a fresh perspective on this guy everyone thinks they know.
Exactly. Think of it like this. We're going to guide you through those parts of Elon Musk's story you don't usually see on your newsfeed. You know, those aha moments. Like, I didn't know that. That kind of thing. And we promise not to overload you with information. So let's jump right in with his early life in South Africa. Everyone always says he was this, like, instant tech genius from day one, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the popular narrative, but when you look at his school records in South Africa, it's not quite so straightforward. Wikipedia actually mentions he was a good student, but not really a standout. You know, he got like a 61 in Afrikaans. AB on his senior math certification makes you think even someone who's seen as a genius might not be top of the class in every subject.
Right. It makes the whole genius thing feel a little less like magic and a little more, well, human. And then there's the whole Canadian passport story. That wasn't just random, was it? Like, there were some pretty big reasons behind that move.
Oh, absolutely. The sources we found really dig into how he went after Canadian citizenship through his mom, who was born there. A big reason was to avoid mandatory military service in South Africa. That was a big deal because it would have meant supporting the apartheid regime, that system of racial segregation and discrimination. And obviously he was against that. Plus, having a Canadian passport meant he could eventually make it to the U.S.
So Canada was more than just a waiting room. It was like a strategic move with multiple layers. And while he was waiting for his Canadian papers, he wasn't just sitting around twiddling his thumbs.
Nope. He spent 5 months at the University of Pretoria. But his biographer makes it sound like it wasn't this serious academic thing, more like something to keep him busy until his Canadian paperwork came through, like filling time.
Makes sense. And then June '89, the big move to Canada. Not exactly the glamorous entrance you'd picture for the guy he becomes later, right?
Not even close. He ended up with a second cousin in Saskatchewan. Pretty different from South Africa, right? And then he had a string of jobs that you wouldn't exactly associate with a future tech billionaire. We're talking farm work. Tending vegetables, shoveling out grain bins, even a stint at a lumber mill cleaning the boiler room for $18 an hour. Pretty stark difference from the life we associate him with now.
It really is. Talk about a glow-up. Boiler rooms to boardrooms. And his university choices. Pretty interesting, too. Went to Queen's University instead of, like, Waterloo. Waterloo's an engineering powerhouse. But apparently he thought there weren't enough women there. Not exactly your typical reason for picking a school, especially for someone who goes on to, revolutionize tech.
Yeah, it says a lot, doesn't it? He apparently told the Queen's alumni magazine that he didn't want to spend his undergraduate time with a bunch of dudes. Pretty honest. Shows what he was thinking about back then. Of course, he eventually transferred to the University of Pennsylvania.
And that brings us to this slightly blurry part of the story. The dates of his degrees. He says he got them in '95. But the University of Pennsylvania's records say '97. What's up with that?
Wikipedia points out that discrepancy. Musk keeps saying he got his degrees in '95, but the university officially says it was '97, a BA in physics and a BS in economics from Wharton. It might seem like a small detail, but it does make you wonder about the way success stories get told. Maybe there's a simple explanation. Or maybe it's a little peek behind the curtain of his public image.
Definitely makes you think. It's those little inconsistencies that are sometimes the most interesting. And while we're talking about university, there's this story about him throwing huge ticketed house parties to pay for tuition. That's some next-level entrepreneurial hustle right there.
For sure. And even back then, he was thinking about big ideas. He apparently wrote a whole business plan for a service that would scan books electronically, basically what Google Books is now, years before Google even existed. Shows how early on he was thinking about using tech to make information accessible to everyone.
Yeah. So even while he was figuring out university and coming up with creative ways to pay for it, his mind was already on the future. Then comes Silicon Valley. 2 internships in '94. One focused on energy storage, the other in gaming. Pretty broad range of interests.
Shows his curiosity. Pinnacle Research Institute and rocket science games. He wanted to be in the middle of innovation. And then there's that almost Stanford thing. He got into a graduate program in materials science in '95, but famously decided not to go.
The allure of the internet, boom. To talk about a life-changing decision. But it wasn't exactly smooth sailing after that. He applied to Netscape, remember? Huge deal back then. Never even heard back.
You can imagine how different things might have been if he had gotten that job. And then there's the whole question of his legal status to work in the U.S. after skipping Stanford. The Washington Post said he didn't have the right paperwork, but Musk says his student visa turned into an H-1B. And even some people who worked with him back then have said he was on a student visa. It's an interesting little mystery from his early career.
Definitely shows a path that was a lot less straightforward than the typical tech prodigy story. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about SpaceX. How did this whole Mars thing turn into him almost buying old Soviet missiles?
Well, it started with the Mars Society. He got involved with them and really got fired up about sending a plant growth chamber to Mars, like a symbolic first step. And to do that, he came up with this rather unusual plan, buying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, from Russia to use as launch vehicles.
Hold on. ICBMs. Like repurposing weapons to deliver a greenhouse to Mars. That's quite a jump. How did those talks even go?
Not great. He went to Moscow twice to meet with NPO, Lavochkin, and Kosmatris, but the price was a huge issue. The Russians wanted $8 million per ICBM. Musk wanted $2 million for that price. Not exactly on the same page.
Classic case of let's agree to disagree. And to make things even more awkward, one of the Russian guys apparently just said, "Young boy, no." Pretty blunt. And I hear Musk didn't take that rejection well.
He stormed out of the meeting. But here's the interesting part. On the flight back, all bummed out about the whole thing, he does what he does. Opens up a spreadsheet. Starts calculating how much it would actually cost to build rockets himself. From scratch. That little in-flight brainstorming session was basically the birth of SpaceX.
So it went from failed missile deals to what one YouTube documentary called Carpet in a Mariachi Band. That's how they describe the early days of SpaceX. Besides Musk's determination, of course, it wasn't exactly a big shot aerospace company, right?
Pretty funny image, right? Carpet and a mariachi band really shows how audacious the whole thing was. But you can't launch rockets on ambition alone. He needed serious engineering know-how. That's where Tom Mueller comes in. The godfather of rocket science, they call him. He was with TRW, which became Northrop Grumman.
The guy who designed the Merlin engine, the engine that powers so many SpaceX launches. How important was that partnership?
Absolutely crucial. Mueller had the deep knowledge of rocket engines that Musk, with his physics and economics background, just didn't have. The YouTube transcript really highlights Mueller's history with amateur rocketry and how he connected with Musk's vision. It was the perfect mix, big thinking and serious engineering chops.
And even with that dream team, the early days of SpaceX were, well, let's just say they were interesting. The first 3 Falcon 1 launches.
Yeah.
All failures. Must have been a tough time.
Intense pressure, uncertainty. The first launch failed because of a stage separation problem. The second had a fuel leak. And the third, get this, it was a timing error that made the 2 stages crash into each other. The documentary really shows how close they were to going broke and how incredibly determined Musk was. He actually said, "I don't ever give up. I mean, I'd have to be dead or completely incapacitated." Shows you his mindset.
That's some serious dedication right there. And then the 4th launch of the Falcon 1 in 2008, the one that finally made it to orbit. That must have been a game changer.
It was everything. That launch wasn't just a win for them. It was what SpaceX needed to survive. It led to that huge $1.6 billion NASA contract to resupply the International Space Station. Basically saved the company. A turning point for private spaceflight.
From almost going bankrupt to landing a major NASA contract, the SpaceX story is amazing. Okay, let's talk about something a little more personal. His relationship with his dad, Elon Musk. Sounds well complicated.
That's putting it mildly. Wikipedia mentions how wealthy his dad was. Even has a story about them having so much cash they couldn't close their safe. Although whether that emerald mine everyone talks about actually existed is still up for debate. But beyond the money, their relationship is always described as turbulent. Elon's called his dad abusive, and it seems like that difficult relationship really affected him.
A safe overflowing with money and a mysterious emerald mine? Sounds like something out of a movie. But the stories about the abuse are really disturbing, like that time he was hospitalized after being attacked at school.
Yeah, that story in his biography is heartbreaking. He was badly beaten at school, ended up in the hospital, and then his dad apparently yelled at him for 90 minutes, called him weak, even took the side of the bullies. It's awful to think about what he went through emotionally, but you have to wonder if that really tough relationship is part of what drives him to succeed. To prove himself, it's a pattern you see a lot with high achievers who had to overcome a lot.
His biographer said that talking about his dad is one of the few things that makes him go quiet and sometimes even cry. That says a lot about how much it still affects him. It's a reminder that even people who seem to have it all can be carrying a lot of pain.
Exactly. It seems like those early experiences really shaped who he is, his drive, maybe even how he interacts with people.
Okay. Fast forward a few decades.
Mm-hmm.
The Twitter takeover. That was a wild ride. And apparently it all involved late nights, lots of Red Bull,
Yeah.
and Ambien.
That's the story that's going around. It sounds like he was getting frustrated with Twitter under Parag Agrawal and Jack Dorsey. He thought they weren't doing enough with video and payments, so he starts down this really unusual path to buying the whole company.
And that secret trip to Larry Ellison's place in Hawaii while dating Natasha Bassett. That sounds like a scene from a movie.
It does. And then there's the Red Bull and Ambien thing. 3 nights in a row, his explanation. It gives me wings. Not the usual side effects you hear about.
Wings at 3 in the morning while you're thinking about buying a multi-billion-dollar company. And then there were those text messages with Parag Agrawal. Apparently it was a full-on pissing match. Doesn't sound like it was very friendly leading up to the offer.
Not at all. And then there's Sam Bankman-Fried. He pops up in the story wanting to invest. But both Musk and Bankman-Fried apparently thought the other was crazy. Bankman-Fried even called Musk a weird dude. Coming from him, that's saying something.
The irony there is pretty amazing. Yeah. So after all that late-night strategizing, Musk decides not to join the board and goes for the hostile takeover. But then he takes this trip to Vancouver.
He flies to Vancouver to see Grimes and introduce their son to her parents. Then, after a TED conference dinner, instead of getting some sleep, he stays up playing Elden Ring until 5:30 in the morning.
Playing video games until dawn after a big business dinner. Not your typical CEO behavior. And then there's that "I made an offer" tweet. The timing is just so weird.
Right. The story is that he sent that tweet right after finishing his gaming marathon. It all adds to this image of him making decisions in really unusual ways, maybe even impulsively. But of course, it's probably an oversimplification to say that those were the only factors in such a huge decision.
Red Bull, Ambien,
Yeah.
Elden Ring, and then buying Twitter. Can't make this stuff up. Okay, let's wrap up with some of his more unconventional views and actions. Apparently, the original plan for SpaceX was to send mice to Mars.
Yeah, that was one of his early ideas, maybe as a test run before sending humans, to see if life could survive on another planet.
And we already talked about why he chose Queen's University.
Yeah.
Not exactly a typical reason, but it definitely shows he has his own priorities.
For sure. And then there's his famous dislike of public transportation. He's called it painful. Says he prefers individual transport. He even brought up the possibility of meeting a serial killer on public transit. It fits with his focus on personal tech solutions. But it's important to remember that's just his opinion. We're not saying we agree with it.
Yeah, we're definitely not endorsing that view. But it's interesting to see how he thinks. And remember that time he called his immigration status in the U.S. a gray area? Kind of an understatement for what could have been a really tricky legal situation.
Definitely. And recently, the European Union has started developing Iris-2 as a potential competitor to Starlink. It shows how much Europe relies on Musk's satellite internet service, and reports suggest they're not exactly thrilled about it.
So Starlink is providing a vital service, but it's also creating some geopolitical tension. And then there's that news from March 2025 about him visiting the Pentagon. As the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, that's a role that came out of, well, let's just say a changing political landscape.
It is. Apparently, he talked to the defense secretary about efficiencies and innovations. His move into government roles, especially that one, is another fascinating and unexpected turn in his story.
Right. From being a good but unexceptional student to advising the government on efficiency. His story is full of surprises. So we've taken you through some parts of Elon Musk's life that you don't usually hear about. We talked about how his early academic record wasn't that amazing, his interesting reason for picking a university, his almost comical attempt to launch his space career with old Russian missiles, and the huge impact his relationship with his dad had on him, and of course the totally bizarre story of how he bought Twitter.
Those less well-known details and weird events really give you a different view of him. They remind you that even the most famous and powerful people have complex backstories, and hopefully we've shown you that looking beyond the headlines can be really interesting.
So here's something to think about. All those unusual things about Elon Musk, the detours, the strange motivations, the sheer boldness of some of his early ideas, How do you think those things will affect his future plans and the impact his companies have? What other seemingly contradictory things might actually be driving innovation and change?
It's a great question, isn't it? Maybe those things that make him so different are also what make him so successful. We encourage you to keep digging deeper and questioning the stories we hear about influential people, because the truth is often much more complicated and fascinating than the headlines make it seem.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you something to think about. Until next time.